In 2016, the quiet suburbs of Houston, Texas, framed the life of Jacob Lewis, a 35-year-old businessman who had carved out a comfortable existence on the outskirts of the bustling city. His home stood as a single-story ranch-style structure, its wide, sprawling design dwarfing the modest houses nearby. A large plot of land stretched out behind it, dotted with sparse, gnarled trees that bent under the relentless Texas sun, their shadows falling across grass bleached to a brittle yellow. Jacob had earned his wealth through a small but thriving chain of car dealerships scattered across the region, a business he'd built with a keen eye for opportunity and a steady hand. Yet, for all his success, his heart belonged not to the gleaming vehicles he sold, but to the 3 adult pit bulls that shared his home, Rocky, Blaze, and Storm. These dogs were more than pets to him. They were a testament to strength, loyalty, and a raw, unspoken bond he cherished deeply. He had named them with care, Rocky for his unyielding stubbornness, Blaze for the fiery energy that coursed through him, and Storm for the quiet unpredictability that simmered beneath his calm exterior. Jacob had transformed the backyard into their domain. He had spent months constructing a training area, complete with wooden obstacles, old tires, and a makeshift agility course that stretched across the dusty expanse. Mornings often found him there before the heat became unbearable, sweat beading on his forehead as he guided the dogs through their routines. He admired the way Rocky leaped over hurdles with a determined grace, how Blaze tore across the ground with relentless speed, and how Storm watched him with sharp, attentive eyes before executing each command. To Jacob, these moments were a ritual, a way to connect with something primal and true in a world he sometimes found lacking in sincerity. The dogs responded to his presence with unwavering devotion, their muscular frames bounding toward him whenever he stepped outside, tails wagging like metronomes set to a joyful beat. He saw in them a purity he rarely encountered elsewhere, a loyalty that didn't waver or deceive. His days followed a predictable rhythm. He rose early, the scent of coffee filling the kitchen as he prepared for the drive to one of his dealerships. There, he met with clients, negotiated deals, and reviewed inventory, his mind sharp and focused. Evenings brought him back to the house, where he traded his pressed shirts for worn jeans and took the dogs for long walks along the cracked sidewalks of the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, lined with low fences and faded mailboxes, and the sound of cicadas hummed in the air as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a solitary life in many ways, but Jacob didn't mind. The dogs filled the silence, their heavy breathing and occasional barks a steady soundtrack to his routine. That rhythm shifted one humid Saturday in late spring when Jacob visited a local fair held in a dusty field just off the highway. The event buzzed with activity, vendors hawking handmade goods, children darting between booths, and the smoky aroma of barbecue drifting through the crowd. He wandered past tables of quilts and jars of preserves until he stopped at a stall adorned with trays of pastries. Behind it stood Emily Reed, a 23-year-old student from the University of Texas, her hands dusted with flour as she arranged cookies and scones. She caught his eye not with her looks, though she had a quiet beauty, but with the way she carried herself, her movements brisk yet warm, her gaze bright with curiosity. Jacob lingered, drawn in by her easy laugh and the way she spoke to customers with genuine interest. He bought a cinnamon roll he didn't need, and before he knew it, they were exchanging names, then stories. Emily was studying biology, she told him, her days split between lectures and part-time jobs to cover tuition. Jacob shared snippets of his own life, his business, his dogs, keeping it light but feeling a spark he hadn't expected. Their connection grew quickly after that day. They met again at a diner the following week, then at a park where Jacob brought the dogs to show off their tricks. Emily watched with wide eyes as Rocky bounded over a bench and Blaze tugged at a rope with fierce determination, her initial wariness giving way to fascination. Within a month, their meetings had turned into something steady, something real. Emily's dorm room, cramped and noisy, began to feel less like home than Jacob's sprawling house. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the dogs wrestle in the yard, she admitted she hated the chaos of campus life. Jacob offered her a way out, his voice casual but his intent clear. She accepted without hesitation, packing her belongings into a battered suitcase and moving in the next day. Her arrival brought a new energy to the house. She cooked dinners in the evenings, filling the kitchen with the scent of spices and roasted vegetables, while Jacob recounted tales of tricky clients or stubborn engines from his workday. On weekends, they took the dogs out together, walking side by side as the pit bulls trotted ahead, their leashes taut in Jacob's hands. The simplicity of it all settled over them like a warm blanket, and for the first time in years, Jacob felt the edges of his solitary world soften. The days following Emily's move into Jacob's home unfolded with an ease that surprised them both, settling into a rhythm that felt as natural as the Texas sun rising over the horizon. Jacob's life, once defined by the steady hum of his business and the companionship of his dogs, now expanded to include Emily's presence, her energy weaving seamlessly into the fabric of his routine. She adapted quickly to his schedule, learning the unspoken patterns of his days, the early mornings when he left for the dealerships, the late afternoons when he returned, dust clinging to his boots from the training yard. Emily, in turn, opened up her world to him, sharing stories of her biology classes and the quirks of her professors, her voice carrying a lightness that filled the house with a warmth it hadn't known before. Her curiosity about the pit bulls marked the first bridge between their lives. At first, she approached Rocky, Blaze, and Storm with caution, her steps tentative as she watched their muscular frames ripple under short, sleek coats. Their broad jaws and intense stares unnerved her, a flicker of fear passing through her eyes whenever they bounded too close. Jacob noticed this and took it upon himself to ease her into their world. He started with simple lessons, showing her how to hold her hand steady for them to sniff, explaining the commands he drilled into them over years: sit, stay, come. He demonstrated how Rocky's ears perked at the slightest whistle, how Blaze responded to a sharp clap, and how Storm tilted his head before obeying, as if weighing the request. Emily listened intently, her hesitance giving way to fascination. Soon, she joined Jacob in the backyard, her voice growing firmer as she called out to the dogs herself. She laughed when Blaze raced to her side, his tongue lolling out, and smiled when Storm nudged her hand for a pat. The dogs accepted her presence, their loyalty stretching to include her, and Jacob saw this as a quiet seal of trust. To him, it meant more than words could express. His dogs were his measure of truth, and their approval of Emily's solidified his growing attachment to her. Jacob's days remained anchored in his work. He drove between his dealerships, the familiar hum of the highway blending with the rattle of his truck's engine. Mornings passed in meetings with suppliers, his sharp mind negotiating terms for new shipments of sedans and pickups. Afternoons found him hunched over paperwork in his office, the faint scent of motor oil lingering on his clothes from a quick check of the service bays. He thrived on the structure, the tangible results of his labor reflected in the gleaming rows of vehicles lining his lots. Emily, meanwhile, navigated her own world. She left the house after Jacob, her beat-up hatchback rumbling toward the University of Texas campus, where she spent hours in lecture halls and labs, her notebooks filled with sketches of cells and ecosystems. She returned in the late afternoon, her bag slung over her shoulder, her face bright with the day's discoveries. Their evenings became a shared sanctuary. They cooked together in the kitchen, Emily chopping vegetables while Jacob tended to a skillet, the sizzle of onions and peppers mingling with the faint aroma of coffee still lingering from breakfast. The dogs sprawled across the tiled floor, their heavy breathing a steady undercurrent to the clatter of pots and pans. The house itself seemed to come alive with their presence. Mornings carried the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee, a ritual Emily insisted on perfecting with a battered old percolator she'd brought from her dorm. The backyard echoed with the dogs' barks as Jacob and Emily took turns tossing a worn tennis ball, watching Rocky leap to catch it mid-air while Blaze and Storm jostled for their chance. Nights often ended in the living room, the pair sprawled on the couch under a quilt Emily had found at a thrift store. They watched old movies on a boxy television, the flickering light casting shadows across the walls as they laughed at dated special effects or debated the endings of forgotten classics. Jacob felt a shift within himself during these moments, a sense that his life, once complete in its solitude, had found a new depth. For the first time in years, he let his thoughts drift toward a future beyond the next business deal or training session. He pictured a ring on Emily's finger, a quiet ceremony under the oaks near his property, the dogs lying at their feet as witnesses. The idea took root slowly, a seed planted in the fertile ground of their happiness. Yet, there were moments when Emily grew distant. Jacob noticed it in the way she stared out the window some evenings, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the armrest, her mind elsewhere. He attributed it to the weight of her studies. Exams loomed on her calendar, and she often stayed late at the library, poring over textbooks. She spoke of her friends occasionally, mentioning a girl named Kate who lived closer to campus. Sometimes, she said, she crashed at Kate's place when the hour grew too late to drive back. Jacob nodded at these explanations, his trust in her unshaken. He had no reason to doubt her. She was part of his world now, as integral as the dogs or the business he'd built. Their life together felt solid, a foundation strong enough to weather the occasional silences. He savored the stability she brought, the way she softened the edges of his days, and let himself believe that nothing could disrupt the peace they'd crafted in that sun-scorched corner of Texas. One humid evening, as the cicadas droned outside and the air hung heavy with the promise of rain, Jacob noticed a shift in Emily's demeanor. She slipped through the front door well past her usual time, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on the floor rather than meeting his. The dogs stirred from their spots near the couch, tails wagging faintly, but she barely acknowledged them, brushing past to drop her bag on the counter. Jacob watched her from the kitchen, a glass of water in his hand, the condensation dripping onto his fingers. He asked where she'd been, his tone casual but edged with curiosity. Emily turned slightly, her shoulders stiff, and said she'd stayed at Kate's after working late on a university project. Her voice carried a flatness that didn't match her usual warmth, and she avoided his gaze, busying herself with unpacking her bag. Jacob nodded, accepting her explanation on the surface, but a faint unease took root in his chest, a whisper of doubt he couldn't shake. He pushed it aside, unwilling to let it grow, and turned back to the sink, rinsing his glass as the dogs settled down again. The next morning unfolded like any other, coffee brewed, the dogs fed, Emily rushing out with a quick wave before driving off to campus. Jacob spent the day at one of his dealerships, his mind occupied with a shipment delay and a client's complaint about a faulty transmission. He returned home in the late afternoon, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the yard. Emily wasn't back yet, but that wasn't unusual, her schedule often stretched into the evening. He fed Rocky, Blaze, and Storm, their eager barks filling the air as they devoured their kibble, then settled into the kitchen to wait. When Emily finally arrived, she carried the same distracted air from the night before, her movements quick and guarded. She mumbled something about a shower and disappeared down the hall, leaving her phone on the kitchen table beside a stack of unopened mail. Jacob stared at it, the small black rectangle glinting under the overhead light. The unease from the previous night flared again, sharper now, urging him to act. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the device, then picked it up, the screen unlocking with a swipe. He opened her messages, scrolling to her thread with Kate, his pulse quickening with each tap. The words he found hit him like a punch to the gut. A message from the night before revealed the truth: Emily hadn't been at Kate's. Instead, she'd written about meeting someone, a guy whose name Jacob didn't recognize, at a bar near downtown Houston, a place he'd never heard her mention. The casual tone of the exchange, the offhand way she described laughing over drinks, cut deeper than any lie he'd imagined. His breath caught, his grip tightening around the phone as betrayal surged through him, hot and bitter. He stood frozen, staring at the screen, the sound of the shower running faintly in the background. The dogs lay in the corner, their heads resting on their paws, oblivious to the storm brewing within him. He waited, the phone still in his hand, each second stretching into an eternity until the water shut off and the bathroom door creaked open. Emily emerged, her hair damp and clinging to her shoulders, a towel wrapped loosely around her. She stepped into the kitchen, stopping short when she saw Jacob standing there, his face a mask of barely contained fury, her phone clutched in his fist. He held it up, the screen still glowing with the damning messages, and the air between them thickened with tension. She froze, her eyes darting from the phone to his expression, realization dawning on her face. Jacob's emotions broke free, his voice rising as he confronted her, the hurt and anger spilling out in waves. Emily's posture shifted, her shoulders squaring as she tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of excuses. But every syllable she offered only fueled his rage, her justifications sounding hollow against the evidence he held. The argument escalated, their voices clashing in the small space, the dogs lifting their heads to watch, ears twitching at the unfamiliar chaos. In a flash of frustration, Emily lunged for the table, her hand closing around a ceramic plate left from breakfast. She swung it with a force born of desperation, the edge catching Jacob across the temple. The impact sent a jolt through him, the plate shattering on contact, shards scattering across the floor. Blood trickled down his face, warm and sticky, pooling at his jaw as he staggered back, stunned. The sharp crack of the blow echoed in the room, and the dogs reacted instantly. Rocky, Blaze, and Storm surged to their feet, their calm demeanor vanishing as their instincts kicked in. Their eyes locked on Emily, hackles rising, growls rumbling deep in their throats. Before Jacob could process the pain or the blood, they lunged, their powerful bodies hurtling toward her in a blur of motion, driven by a primal need to protect their master from the sudden threat. The chaos erupted in an instant, a violent unraveling that swallowed the kitchen whole. Rocky, Blaze, and Storm, their loyalty to Jacob an unyielding force, launched themselves at Emily with a ferocity that defied their usual discipline. Their jaws snapped, muscles rippling under taut skin as they tore into her, driven by an instinct sharpened by the sight of their master's blood. Emily's screams pierced the air, high and desperate, her arms flailing as she tried to fend them off. She stumbled backward, her towel slipping to the floor, her hands clawing at the counter for support, but the dogs pressed their attack, relentless and unyielding. Rocky latched onto her leg, his growl a low rumble, while Blaze leaped for her torso, his weight knocking her off balance. Storm circled, darting in with quick, savage bites, his eyes wild with purpose. The room filled with the sounds of snarling and thrashing, a cacophony that drowned out everything else. Jacob reeled from the blow to his head, the sting of blood in his eyes blurring his vision as he staggered forward. His mind struggled to catch up, the pain and shock warring with a rising panic as he saw the dogs turn on Emily. He lunged toward them, his voice hoarse as he shouted commands, "Stop, down, leave it," words that had always brought them to heel before. But this time, they ignored him, their ears deaf to his pleas, their focus locked on the threat they perceived. He grabbed Rocky's collar, yanking with all his strength, but the dog twisted free, his powerful frame unyielding. Blaze snapped at the air as Jacob reached for him, nearly catching his hand in those iron jaws. Storm darted past, too quick to grasp, his teeth sinking into Emily again. Jacob's hands shook, slick with sweat and blood, his efforts futile against the chaos he'd unleashed. The kitchen became a battlefield, blood smeared across the tiles, shards of the broken plate crunching underfoot, chairs toppling as Emily's body hit the floor. Her cries weakened, then faded into a terrible silence, her form crumpling beneath the onslaught. Jacob stumbled back, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the reality settled over him. Emily lay motionless, her body torn and still, the dogs pacing around her, their muzzles stained red. He sank to his knees, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he fumbled for his phone, discarded on the counter during the fight. His fingers slipped on the screen, leaving bloody streaks as he dialed 911, his voice barely a whisper when the operator answered. He stayed there, crouched on the floor, staring at the wreckage until sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they closed in. The police burst through the door first, their shouts cutting through the haze, guns drawn as they took in the scene. Paramedics followed, their movements brisk but futile as they knelt beside Emily, confirming what Jacob already knew. The dogs, still growling, their hackles raised, retreated to the back door, where an officer herded them into the yard and slammed it shut. Jacob sat numbly as the officers swarmed the house, their questions a dull roar in his ears. Blood dripped from his temple, pooling on the floor beside him, but he barely felt it. They handcuffed him, their grips firm as they led him to the squad car, his legs moving mechanically. From the window, he glimpsed animal control arriving, the truck pulling up with a grim purpose. He tried to protest, his voice cracking as he pleaded for his dogs, insisting they'd only acted to protect him, but the words fell on deaf ears. The officers ignored him, their faces set in hard lines, and soon the sharp crack of gunshots echoed from the backyard, 3 shots, 1 for each pit bull. Jacob flinched with every sound, his body slumping against the car seat as the loss sank in. At the station, the investigation kicked into gear with ruthless efficiency. Detectives pored over the scene, piecing together a narrative of domestic violence gone wrong, an argument, a blow, a fatal escalation. Jacob tried to explain, his hands still cuffed as he described the plate, the betrayal, the dog's reaction, but his story drowned in the tide of evidence against him, the blood, the body, the shattered remnants of their life. The truth he clung to slipped away, buried beneath the weight of the night's horror. The trial unfolded as a spectacle that gripped the county, drawing crowds to the courthouse in downtown Houston where the air buzzed with whispers and the clatter of cameras. Jacob sat in the defendant's chair, his once sharp features dulled by weeks of sleepless nights and the weight of scrutiny. The prosecution charged him with involuntary manslaughter and negligence in handling dangerous animals, their case built on the wreckage of that fateful night. His business, once a source of pride, crumbled in the aftermath. Clients canceled deals, suppliers cut ties, and his dealerships, stripped of their reputation, stood half empty, their lots gathering dust under the Texas sun. News vans parked outside his home for days, their lenses trained on the now silent backyard where Rocky, Blaze, and Storm had once roamed. The story spread like wildfire, a cautionary tale splashed across headlines, and Jacob's name became synonymous with tragedy. In the courtroom, the prosecutor painted a damning portrait. He described Jacob as a man unmoored, reckless in his control over both his life and the animals he'd raised. He pointed to the bloodstains on Jacob's hands, the chaos of the upturned kitchen, the sheer brutality of Emily's death as evidence of a failure too profound to forgive. Witnesses took the stand, neighbors who recalled hearing the dog's frenzied barking, a paramedic who detailed the grisly scene, a forensic expert who traced the sequence of violence step by step. The prosecutor's voice carried a cold authority, each word hammering into the jury's perception, framing Jacob as a man whose passions had spiraled into destruction. Jacob's attorney fought back, his arguments rooted in desperation. He cast Jacob as a victim of circumstance, a man betrayed and blindsided, whose dogs had acted out of loyalty rather than malice. He gestured to the cut on Jacob's temple, still faintly visible, as proof of Emily's aggression, insisting the tragedy stemmed from a chain of events beyond Jacob's control. But the evidence loomed larger, the shattered plate, the overturned furniture, the neighbors' testimonies, and the attorney's pleas struggled to pierce the narrative already taking shape. Jacob sat through it all, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze fixed on the wooden table. The courtroom hummed with activity, reporters scribbling notes, jurors shifting in their seats, the judge's gavel striking with a rhythm that marked the days. He barely moved, his mind drifting to the dogs he'd lost, their bodies now gone, buried, or disposed of without ceremony. He saw Rocky's steady gait, Blaze's boundless energy, Storm's quiet watchfulness, and felt the ache of their absence like a physical wound. Emily's face haunted him too, her laughter replaced by the memory of her final moments, her blood pooling on the tiles he'd once scrubbed clean. Guilt gnawed at him, a relentless current beneath his stillness. He replayed every moment, the trust he'd placed in her, the signs he'd missed, the commands he'd shouted to no avail. If he'd seen the fracture in their bond sooner, if he'd held the dogs back, if he'd never picked up that phone, each if carved deeper into his regret. The trial stretched over weeks, each day piling onto the last until the jury returned with their verdict. The judge's voice cut through the tension, delivering the sentence, 15 years in prison. Jacob stood as the words landed, his body rigid, his eyes empty. The courtroom blurred around him, the faces of strangers, journalists, onlookers, a few familiar locals, melting into a haze. He felt the cold bite of handcuffs on his wrists, the firm grip of the bailiff guiding him away, but his thoughts lingered elsewhere. He blamed himself, not for the courtroom's judgment, but for the failures that led him there. As he passed through the doors, he cast a final glance over his shoulder, taking in the sea of eyes watching his exit. Reporters jostled for position, their pens poised to capture the fall of a man once respected, now reduced to a cautionary figure. The weight of it settled over him, a certainty as solid as the bars that awaited. He understood, in that moment, that the life he'd known was gone forever, shattered beyond repair by the night that had claimed everything he held dear. Jacob served his sentence in a maximum security prison, a hulking fortress of concrete and steel nestled in the flatlands a few hours' drive from Houston, where the horizon stretched endlessly under a sky that offered no comfort. His days blurred into a monotonous cycle, each one a repetition of the last. Mornings began with the clang of cell doors and the shuffle of feet as guards herded inmates to the workshop. There, Jacob spent hours hunched over machinery, his hands, once steady with a wrench at his dealerships, now calloused and stained with grease as he repaired engines for the state. The work was mindless, a grind that kept his body busy but left his mind free to wander. Meals came next, served on scratched metal trays in a cavernous cafeteria where the food tasted of salt and stale air, gray slabs of meat, watery potatoes, a slice of bread that crumbled at the touch. Afterward, he returned to his cell, a narrow box with a bunk, a sink, and a toilet, its walls etched with the scratches of men who'd come before him. The confident businessman he'd once been faded, replaced by a quieter, hollower version of himself, his shoulders stooped under the weight of his new reality. The prison pressed in on him, its grayness seeping into his bones. The air carried the constant hum of voices, the clatter of metal, the occasional shout that echoed down the corridors, but Jacob tuned it out, retreating into his thoughts. Memories shadowed him relentlessly, trailing him through every task. He saw Rocky's broad head resting on his knee, Blaze tearing across the yard in a burst of energy, Storm's steady gaze meeting his own. Their loyalty had defined his world, a bond he trusted above all else, and yet it had twisted into the instrument of his ruin. He replayed their final moments, the gunshots that ended their lives, the silence that followed, each recollection sharpening the ache in his chest. Emily lingered there too, her face flickering between the warmth of their early days and the horror of her last. The guilt gnawed at him, a quiet companion that never left, whispering of every choice that led to that night. Sleep offered no escape. He often woke in the dark, his ears straining for the phantom bark of his dogs, only to find the stillness of concrete and the faint snores of his cellmate. Letters from the outside arrived sparingly, their envelopes thin and worn by the time they reached him. A few friends wrote at first, their words cautious and stilted, but the correspondence dwindled as months turned to years. His family pulled away entirely, their absence a wound he felt but didn't question. They couldn't face the man he'd become, the story that now defined him. In the prison yard, where inmates gathered under the watchful eyes of guards, Jacob kept to himself. He walked the perimeter alone, his head down, avoiding the clusters of men trading stories or bartering contraband. Fights broke out sometimes, fists flying over petty slights, but he steered clear, his presence unremarkable save for the whispers that followed him. His reputation preceded him, a murmured tale of the man whose dogs had torn a woman apart, and though no one challenged him directly, he felt the weight of their judgment in every sidelong glance. Time stretched on, marked by the slow turn of seasons he could only sense through the sliver of window in his cell. The Texas heat seeped in during summer, leaving the walls slick with damp, while winter brought a chill that settled into the floors. Years passed, each one eroding his ties to the world beyond the razor wire. The dealerships he'd built were gone, sold off or shuttered, his name erased from the signs. The house stood empty, its yard overgrown, a relic claimed by time and neglect. Jacob stopped imagining his release, the idea of freedom growing abstract, a distant promise he no longer believed in. Even if the gates opened, he knew the life he'd lost, his dogs, his business, the simplicity of those days with Emily, couldn't be reclaimed. His story lingered in the county's memory, passed around in hushed tones at gas stations and diners, a grim fable of love and trust undone by passion's dark edge. Inside the prison, he existed as a shadow, counting down the days not to an end, but to an emptiness he'd already begun to inhabit.